Hello, class. Today we would be learning about how stimuli is interpreted and how do receptors work. So, stimuli are detected by either the dendrite of a unipolar neuron or it is detected by an individual cell. And what I mean by an individual cell is that this cell will basically synapse into the next neuron, okay? So for example, in our ear, our special senses, the hair cell will basically synapse into the next neuron. So think of, this one is for, let's say, unipolar neuron. Well, this one, you can think of the hair cell example, okay? So for example, this is the hair cell and here is a neuron. Okay? And then neuron. Think of it that way. So when, let's say, this is stimulated, this receptor, it will send signals onto that associated neuron. And when a stimulation occurs, okay, in either the dendrite or the individual hair cell, we would have the opening of those sodium, okay? Sodium voltage gated channels will open, okay? And as they open, it becomes more electrical, generating graded potential. Okay, so let us say that the neuron has been stimulated, or the individual cell. When a graded potential occurs, that would be for, let's say, the general senses, okay? And remember, as we have learned, graded potentials are basically either the neuron has depolarized or it has hyperpolarized. In other words, it just changed in membrane potential. So for general senses, that would be, let's say you touch something, let's say the Meissner corpuscle receptor touch something, that would be considered general senses and there would be a graded potential. Okay? However, let's say it is a special sense, right? So let's say a special sense, let's say the hair cell example, this would generate the receptor potential. So you could think of the hair cell that has detected vibration of noises. This will generate receptor potential and send neurotransmitters to the next neurons, generating an excitatory postsynaptic potential in that next neuron and possibly an action potential. Okay, let us look at the two main types of receptors. So besides looking at receptors of either being a neuron or an individual cell, there are different receptors which allows either adaptation or not. So the first one is the phasic receptors. So for phasic receptors, these types of receptors respond to stimulus change. However, that in response to that stimulus, it can actually adapt. Okay? So these types of receptors are able to adapt to that stimulation. You could think of like wearing clothes or like wearing a hat. At first, the phasic receptors will basically be very high, but then eventually the sensitivity of it will decrease, and decreasing sensitivity is what you want because, for example, you don't want to be constantly noticed by your phasic receptors that there are, you're wearing something, and that wouldn't be very helpful, wouldn't it? So there would be a decrease in sensitivity after the burst of that action potential. The decrease in the action potential frequency to our central nervous system will naturally decrease, and it will generally maintain a constant strength until you take it you another stimulation occurs. Let's say you take off your clothes or your hat or whatever is on touching that phasic receptor. If there is another stimulus, then yes, it will be detected again. So you could think of wearing, you can think of removing. So you're wearing a hat or you're removing a hat. So, and you can see here, this is when you're just wearing. Okay, you can think of here, you just put it on, it's on you the whole day, and then you remove it, it adapts. The other one would be tonic receptors. Tonic receptors, the frequency of the action potential is constant. So in other words, there is no adaptation. So once you wear something, or once this receptor is stimulated, it is just constantly stimulated. So for examples, like when you're in pain, that will be constant. Your certain posture, a certain condition, protective instincts. Okay, so here we mentioned about wearing. You could think of, for example, this is not a good drawing, but let's say this is your finger, not a really good finger, and this is a nail. Okay, you could think of pain, posture, and the condition that you are in. And the intensity of that stimulus will be constant. So no adaptation. How does our brain perceive different types of stimuli? So the way that our brain determines this, so let's just write that. So how does it, how do you know? So actually this is determined by the frequency. So by frequency of the action potential. So if the frequency of the action potential is a lot farther, this means that the stimulus is not that strong. So you can think of this as like a feather falling onto you compared to, let's say, a higher frequency of action potential. So you can think of a brick falling on your feet. So that's how our brain will basically perceive stimuli and determine its strength. Okay? So determine the strength based on this action potential. Now, that strength of that stimuli also depends on which receptor is being stimulated. So if let's say it is your touch receptor, the Meissner corpuscle, obviously the impulses will basically be sent to let's say the postcentral gyrus region for touching, and depending on that strength of that stimuli, so if it is either high frequency or low frequency, it really depends. Okay, so if you touch something that's really hot, most likely this is what's gonna happen. So your thermoreceptors, right? Or let's say you carry something light versus heavy. So you can think of Meissner corpuscle here for touch. So if you hold something heavy, your touch receptors can, your receptors will be able to tell generally on the type of receptor that is stimulated. In other words, your brain will obviously know based on the receptor that is stimulated. The other thing to look at is, let's say, your the other thing to look at is, let's say, your eyes, right? So if a certain light is much more stronger, they will likely have more frequency of action potentials than something that is not as bright. So let's say you press your eyes. So let's see your eyeball. Let's say you press your eyes. All signals that will be perceived from the retina of your eye would actually be perceived as light. Okay, so if something's really bright, woo, you have high frequency versus low frequency. So it doesn't just apply to the strength, right? Like physical strength of how heavy something is. It could also be to our special senses, like how frequent that stimulation is. And yeah, that's all for today. So thank you for joining for today's class.